I heard my son yell, "Get out of my house, you are nothing but dead weight." And before I could even process the sting of those words, he threw my suitcase across the concrete floor of the garage so hard that the only photo I had left of my late sister shattered inside the frame. The sound of glass breaking felt sharper than the winter air cutting into my face. I stood there frozen on the driveway in southwest Omaha while my own child pointed at me like I was a stranger he wanted gone before the neighbors noticed. But they had noticed. They were already watching from porches, and behind windows the same people who once praised me for sewing their curtains or fixing their jackets now stared at me the way someone looks at a broken appliance sitting on the curb. And then Haley lifted her phone, smiled, and told her viewers they should look at this mess. She kept recording while Evan shoved my coat into my arms. Her voice cut through the cold. "You will never get a dime from us, you understand," she said. "You are worth nothing." I felt my throat burn, but no sound came out. I wanted to speak, but humiliation pressed against my chest so hard that the words never formed. I had lived here for 4 years, doing laundry, cooking every meal, watching their kids, while sewing until midnight, and still I was treated like an unwanted guest in my own son's home. My legs weakened, and I bent down to pick up the suitcase, the seams tearing further, as if even the bag did not want to go with me. That was the moment the panic arrived, the moment I realized I truly had nowhere to go. I was 50 years old, working as a seamstress who patched together clothes much like I had patched together every broken moment in my life, always convincing myself that love from my only child would make the sacrifice worth it. But now Evan stood in front of me, jaw-tight eyes cold as steel, telling me that I was someone he could simply discard. When did he become this person? When did Haley's smooth comments and shallow lifestyle turn him into someone capable of looking at me with disgust? I could not answer those questions. All I knew was that I had spent years believing I was a burden. And in this moment, Evan confirmed every fear I had ever swallowed. A gust of wind pushed snow against my shoes, and I staggered backward, slipping slightly, as the cold began to seep through the fabric of my thin socks. I held the broken photo frame in my hands, pressing the cracked glass against my coat, as if trying to keep the memory from falling apart completely. That photo was the last picture of my sister Lorraine before she disappeared from my life decades ago, and even though I never told Evan what she meant to me, he still treated the frame like garbage. I tried to stand upright, but the weight of everything pressed against me until I dropped to one knee. Haley's voice rose again. She said, "Look at her, Evan. She is acting like we did something wrong." And then she laughed. That short, tight laugh she used whenever she thought she had won some kind of performance. Evan stepped closer, so close I could see my reflection in his sunglasses, a reflection I barely recognized, a woman worn down by years of trying to be enough for someone who never appreciated her. He said, "You should feel lucky we let you stay this long." Lucky. He used that word as if allowing me to babysit for free pay, part of their bills, and give up my bedroom for their second child was some kind of gift. I reminded myself to breathe, but the wind cut deeper, and my chest squeezed tighter. I pushed myself back onto my feet, gripping the strap of the suitcase that now hung by a single thread. As I turned the corner of the driveway, my foot slipped on a patch of ice, and I fell forward, hitting the snow hard enough that the breath left my lungs. For a moment, I just lay there, listening to the muffled sound of my son closing the garage door behind me. It sounded final, like an ending. I pushed my hands into the snow to stand, and my fingers brushed against something inside the torn side pocket of the suitcase. A thin envelope, old edges curled slightly, Arizona printed faintly across the corner. I froze. I'd forgotten it was still there. I had hidden it from Evan years ago after he mocked me for dreaming of anything beyond sewing hems and patching jeans. An envelope I never opened because I was too afraid of hoping again. I held it tightly against my palm as I pulled myself upright. The cold burned my skin, but the envelope felt strangely warm. A small, stubborn spark flickered inside me, the first in a long time. and I heard myself whisper a question I never dared to ask until the moment my son shut the door on me. If I disappeared today, would anyone even notice? I kept walking through the cold that sliced across my cheeks, and even though my legs shook beneath me, I forced myself forward carrying the broken suitcase and the cracked photo frame, because I had nothing else left and nowhere else to stand the sting of Evan's voice still echoing in my ears, while the snow crunched under my shoes, and for a moment I wondered how long it would take before the numbness of humiliation finally settled into my bones. As I reached the end of the street, I felt the heaviness of everything that had led me to this moment, not just the shouting or the broken frame or the neighbors pretending not to stare, but the quiet history of years where I had convinced myself that sacrifice was simply what mothers did, and now that I had crossed the boundary of my son's driveway, I could finally see the pattern I had been too tired and too hopeful to notice. For 2 years, I had paid the daycare for my granddaughter, telling myself that Evan and Haley were young and still learning responsibility, and that covering the payments was just temporary support. And I never imagined that Evan had been using my debit card for more than just groceries, because every time I questioned why my balance was lower than expected, he would laugh softly and tell me I must have misremembered or paid a bill twice. And I believed him, because believing the alternative meant accepting that my son could look at me not as a mother, but as a resource. I remembered how Haley once waved a credit card bill in front of him, complaining about the interest piling up, and how the very next month I saw a withdrawal I did not recognize, but ignored, because the holidays were coming and the kids needed coats. And now I realized that Evan had been paying off her debt with my account long before today, stripping away pieces of my security little by little, while assuring me I was imagining things. I thought it could not get worse until the night he told me I needed to move to the basement because their eldest child needed more space upstairs. And Haley was worried that having me sleep in the spare room made the house feel crowded. And when I tried to remind them that I paid for half the groceries and cooked every meal, Evan looked at me with irritation and said people your age should live quietly, which sounded like a polite suggestion, but felt like a door shutting in my face. That basement had no proper heating, and sometimes during the winter, I would sit up wrapped in 2 blankets stitching clothes for clients, while listening to them laugh upstairs, and though the cold crept into my fingers every night, I still told myself that being close to my son and grandkids made the discomfort worth enduring. And yet in all those years of sewing late into the night and adjusting hems for neighbors and repairing tears in winter coats, the one thing I never touched was the small bundle of documents tucked inside the tin box beneath my sewing notions. A bundle that held the stock certificates my sister Lorraine had mailed to me before she disappeared from my life forever. Certificates I did not fully understand and barely valued because 10 years ago they were worth almost nothing. And after Evan once caught me reading them at the table and mocked them as scraps from a dead dream, I folded them away and promised myself I would never let him see them again. I had forgotten about them until the moment the garage door slammed behind me. Forgotten that the papers inside that box represented the only piece of Lorraine I still carried. And as I trudged through the snow with the envelope from the torn suitcase pocket pressing against my coat, I wondered if I had been blind or just desperate to keep love intact, even when it bruised me over and over. Every memory of the past years began to rearrange itself in my mind, forming a picture I could no longer ignore, like the way Evan always asked me to lend him small amounts for gas or groceries, and then never mentioned repayment, or how Haley insisted she needed help buying supplies for the birthday parties she wanted to post online because appearances mattered and how I had agreed, because I wanted them to see me as supportive, not needy. The truth settled in slowly like the winter chill creeping up my sleeves, that I had been funding their comfort while barely affording my own, that they had taken advantage, not because they were incapable, but because it was easier to use what I had than to appreciate who I was. I felt shame rise in my throat, but beneath it, something else appeared, something firmer, and more defined. A quiet awareness that the injustice had been building long before the moment Evan shouted at me in the garage, long before the live stream and the accusations and the shattered frame. And once that awareness arrived, it refused to fade. I stopped under a streetlight and let the cold air fill my lungs as I brought a hand to my face, wiping away the tears that had frozen at the corners of my eyes. And as I held the envelope, a thought surfaced that felt strangely steady, that maybe the story I had accepted as the truth of my life was not the whole story, and maybe the sacrifices I made were not signs of weakness, but proof that I had more strength than anyone in that house ever recognized. The envelope felt heavier now, not because of its physical weight, but because of the possibility it represented. And even though I did not yet know what was inside or what it could mean, I sensed a shift beginning inside me. The early tremor of something rising slowly, like a voice breaking through years of silence. And even though the road ahead felt uncertain, I kept moving because for the first time in a long while, I was beginning to see that the injustice that pushed me out of my son's house might also be the force that led me back to myself. I walked farther down the block until the cold eased just enough for me to steady my breath. But the shame of what had happened kept replaying with every step, as if the whole neighborhood had carved the scene into the air. And even though I tried to focus on the snow melting beneath the streetlights, I could still hear Haley's voice from earlier that week rising above the fence while she chatted with Mrs. Collins across the yard, saying that I did not contribute anything, that I simply stayed in their home without lifting a finger. And I remembered standing inside the kitchen with my hands deep in soapy water, listening to her invent a version of me I barely recognized, one where I was a freeloader instead of the woman who had folded every shirt in that house and paid thousands in daycare without a word. The humiliation that coated those days had not been sudden. Like today, it had been slow and steady, like frost spreading across a window pane, and I recalled how the neighbors began looking at me differently after Haley's stories spread their glances, no longer warm, but curious, almost suspicious, and instead of seeing me as the woman who had hemmed their dresses and repaired their winter coats, they now saw only what Haley told them to see: an aging woman living off her son. I had tried to brush off the whispers, but then came the afternoon Evan stood in the driveway while talking loudly to two neighbors who were unloading groceries, and he said that I lived in his house without paying rent, that he was generous to keep me there, and I remembered gripping the handle of the trash bin so tightly my knuckles ached because the lie felt like a slap that burned long after the moment passed. I had been paying for food diapers, daycare utilities, even home repairs that Evan never admitted were covered by my card. Yet, he said it so casually, as if generosity were flowing from him and not the other way around, and the neighbors nodded politely, not knowing that the woman who washed their curtains at half price was being painted as a burden. The memory tightened in my chest because that was the first moment I felt myself disappear inside my own life. The version of me Evan created began to replace the real me, and all I could do was swallow the hurt and keep working, hoping that my silence would hold my family together. But humiliation does not stay contained. It spills into every corner, and by the time I reached the bus stop that night after being thrown out, I could feel that shame sitting in my shoulders, heavier than the suitcase. And I kept reminding myself to breathe, even though each breath carried the echo of Evan's words. I stood beneath the flickering street lamp, adjusting my coat, when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Mr. Peterson, the older man who lived 3 houses down, approaching slowly, with his hands tucked into his pockets, his gray scarf fluttering in the wind, and even though I wanted to shrink away from being seen in this state, he offered a gentle nod, as if he knew not to speak too loudly. He glanced at the torn corner of my suitcase, where the envelope peeked out slightly, and his eyes sharpened with a familiarity I did not understand, and he leaned in just enough that his voice carried only to me as he asked if I knew that the company printed on that envelope was preparing to go public soon. For a moment, I simply stared at him, unsure of what he meant, because the words preparing to go public sounded distant, like they belonged in someone else's world. And the shock of hearing anyone recognize the name from Arizona made my pulse quicken, as if the cold had suddenly turned electric. I swallowed hard and told him quietly that the envelope belonged to my sister, nothing more. And he nodded again, but his expression held something deeper. Something like worry or maybe warning, and he said that stocks from that sector had been discussed often on the news and that many companies were seeing sharp increases. Then he paused, studying me closely before adding that if the documents inside were what he thought they were, I needed to take care of them. His words lingered in the air like a thin thread pulling at everything I thought I understood, and I clutched the envelope tighter, feeling a tremor run across my fingertips as I thanked him without knowing exactly why. He gave my arm a gentle pat before stepping back, telling me to get somewhere warm and that storms were expected overnight, and I watched him walk away slowly until the dark swallowed him at the corner. I stood there under the dim streetlight, with snow drifting around me and the envelope pressing against my palm like a secret, finally waking up, and for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar rising through me. Not hope exactly, but a faint shift in the balance of my life, a feeling that the humiliation that had shaped me for so long might not define what comes next. I took a slow breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs as the thought settled inside me that maybe Evan and Haley were not the only ones who misunderstood my worth. Maybe I, too, had spent years believing I was small and disposable, when something inside that envelope suggested otherwise. And as I lifted my suitcase and stepped toward the bus, approaching in the distance, I realized that even though I felt broken and unanchored, I had just been reminded by a quiet, observant neighbor that not everything in my life was as hopeless as my son wanted me to believe. The bus rattled through the quiet Omaha streets while I sat curled near the window, holding the envelope against my chest, as if it were the only warm thing left in my life. And even though the humiliation of what had happened clung to me like frost, I could not stop my mind from drifting back to all the smaller moments, the loops and turns that had led to this breaking point. Moments I once brushed aside because acknowledging them felt too painful. Yet now, they lined up in my memory with a clarity that made my stomach twist. I remembered the afternoon Evan came home frustrated about the insurance bill on his car, and how he looked at me with that quiet expectation he always carried when he wanted something. The kind of look that suggested I owed him for giving me a place to stay, and he told me casually that he needed to put my name on the Honda's registration for a discount, saying it was temporary and harmless, and I had hesitated because the car was technically mine purchased years before, with the money I earned from sewing gowns during prom season. But Evan insisted it would help his credit score, and that any mother who cared about her son would not make such a small thing into a big deal. When I said I needed time to think, he sighed loudly, then handed me the pen anyway, and I remember how weak my voice sounded when I told him I was not comfortable signing anything without understanding the consequences. But he brushed off my worry and said I should trust him because he knew better about these things, and the pressure in his eyes felt heavier than the pen in my hand. I did not sign that day, but the shame of disappointing him lingered long after the conversation ended. And then there was the week Haley decided the house needed renovations. Not the entire house, but the living room where she filmed her online content and wanted a space that looked more polished. And she approached me while stirring a pot of soup I was making for the kids, her tone light and sweet, like she was offering me a chance to contribute instead of placing a burden on my shoulders. She said that a small home improvement loan would help the family appear more presentable, and that putting the loan under my name would be easier since I had no debt. And I remember feeling confused because I already paid so many of their bills. And still, she looked at me like I was not doing enough, like I should be grateful for the privilege of supporting them. I told her politely that I did not want to take out any loans, that my income was too unstable to risk something so large, but the smile slipped off her face almost immediately, and her voice sharpened as she said that she and Evan had been carrying me for years, that I had lived under their roof rent-free, that I owed them something tangible. I remember how my heart thudded in my chest as she stepped closer, lowering her voice with a bitterness that stung more than the cold outside the window now, while she said, "If you do not help us, you are out. We do not feed useless people." That sentence had been playing on repeat in my head since she screamed it again earlier, when they pushed me out of the house, and in the bus window I could almost see her expression reflected back at me, triumphant and cruel. I knew then that the abuse had not started with the screaming or the live stream. It had begun long ago in those small humiliations, the subtle guilt, the way they chipped away at my dignity until I barely recognized myself, and each time I justified it by telling myself that every family had rough patches, that my son was overwhelmed, that Haley was stressed, that love required patience. But patience had turned into silence, and silence into surrender. And now as the bus turned toward downtown, I realized that even before they threw me out, they had been pushing me out piece by piece, replacing respect with expectation and affection with obligation. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the rising ache inside me, and when I opened them again, I saw a familiar notification glow through the screen of my old phone. A faint blinking light that indicated a new email had arrived, and as I swiped to unlock the screen, I saw the sender's address, a name from Arizona that I had not seen in years, the same name printed on the envelope now tucked inside my coat. My breath caught slightly, a tightness forming in my throat as I stared at the subject line, which mentioned an update about Lorraine's holdings, and for a moment the world outside the window blurred, because a part of me wanted to open it desperately to know if there was something meaningful inside, if the years of holding on to hope had not been foolish after all. But fear rose faster than curiosity. Fear that opening it might confirm nothing had changed, that the envelope and the old certificates were still worthless, that the last piece of my sister I had left amounted to nothing. I locked the phone with shaking fingers, pressing it into my lap as the bus rolled forward, and the shame mixed with faint trembling hope inside me until I felt dizzy. I leaned my head against the glass, letting the cold seep into my skin because it grounded me as I whispered to myself that disappointment was easier to carry than hope, that it hurt less to expect nothing. The email remained unopened, sitting quietly in my inbox, like a heartbeat I refused to acknowledge. And as the streetlight stretched across the road ahead of me, I wondered if my fear of being hurt again was the only thing holding me back, or if I simply did not believe I deserved anything good anymore. The bus dropped me off near the edge of downtown as the sky grew darker, and I walked with slow, unsteady steps toward the small, rented room I sometimes used when I needed space from the noise of Evan's house. My mind drifting back through every memory until they tangled so tightly I could barely separate one from another. And somewhere inside that thick fog of hurt, I found the moment when everything had begun to crumble, in ways I did not fully understand, until now a day that seemed ordinary at first, but revealed itself as the crack that split my world open. I had returned home after running errands for Haley, who had insisted I pick up decorations for one of her video backdrops, and I remember balancing the grocery bags on my hip as I walked toward the basement, expecting to hear the soft hum of my sewing machine, a sound that always comforted me, because it reminded me that I still had purpose, still had a skill to offer, still had clients who trusted my hands more than they trusted any tailor in town. But that day, the basement felt unnaturally quiet, the stillness unsettling, and when I reached the corner where my workstation stood, I felt the ground tilt beneath me because the table was empty. The shelves were bare, the machines were gone, and the neatly folded fabric I had saved for custom orders had vanished as if swallowed by the dark. For a long moment, I simply stared, frozen in place, unable to move or breathe or think, because the machines were not just tools, they were my independence. the one thing in that house that truly belonged to me, and losing them felt like losing the last piece of myself I had protected. When Evan walked downstairs, I turned to him, still gripping the empty table edge for balance, my lips trembling as I tried to ask where they had gone, and he shrugged casually as if I had asked about the weather rather than the disappearance of my livelihood, and he said he sold them to pay down some bills that the family needed the money more than I needed old equipment collecting dust, and when I whispered through the tightness in my throat that they were mine and he had no right, he responded with a dismissive wave of his hand and said you did not use them anyway, which lodged in my chest like a blade twisted slowly until I could not form another word. In that instant, the world felt unbearably small, the walls compressing around me until I could barely see, and the weight of every sacrifice I had made crushed down on me with such force that I had to grip the stair railing just to stay standing, because he had not only taken my machines, he had taken the last thread of stability that kept me from disappearing completely. I stood there shaking, feeling something inside me fracture, not in a loud dramatic break, but in a quiet, irreversible way, like glass cracking beneath pressure, until it splinters silently into pieces too small to gather. The grief was overwhelming, a grief not only for the machines, but for the realization that the son I had loved and raised and protected no longer saw me as a person with needs or boundaries or dignity, only as someone whose belongings could be taken when convenient. For the rest of that week, I moved through the house like a ghost, cooking meals, folding laundry, wiping counters, pretending nothing had changed, because admitting the truth out loud felt like letting the whole world collapse on top of me. And Evan acted as though I should be grateful he had solved a financial problem, while Haley offered a forced smile and said I would feel better once the house looked more organized, without so much clutter. I nodded and remained silent, because words felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice that could break beneath me. But something inside me shifted, something slow and patient and frighteningly clear. I began to collect every receipt I found lying beneath a stack of mail, every screenshot of transactions Evan claimed he did not make, every message Haley sent, asking for money, and I slid them quietly into a small folder I kept hidden under the old winter coats in the basement closet. I told no one, not even myself, that I was gathering evidence, but my hands moved with purpose each time I added a new document. And even though I still felt lost and hollow, the act of collecting the truth gave me a whisper of steadiness, a faint reminder that even broken people can hold on to small pieces of power if they choose. The darkness of that week stretched long and suffocating, each day blending into the next, until time itself felt heavy. And yet each night as I sat alone on the cold basement floor, I felt something new taking shape inside the emptiness, something like the early outline of a plan, even though I had not yet dared to name it. And though fear still clung to me, I felt a thin thread of resolve winding through the fear, growing stronger with every document I placed in that folder, a quiet seed of resistance beginning to sprout in the deepest part of the dark. The week after Evan sold my sewing machines moved slowly, like a long ache spreading through every hour, and even though I kept collecting receipts and messages in the hidden folder, I still felt like a woman walking through fog with no clear direction until the day of my granddaughter's birthday arrived, a day that should have been filled with warmth, but instead pushed everything to its breaking point. I remember waking early that morning to bake cupcakes because Haley insisted homemade looked better on her live stream, and I knew she did not mean homemade by her hands, so I stood in the kitchen mixing batter while the sound of her laughter drifted from the living room, where she rehearsed poses for the camera, and even as exhaustion tugged at me, I tried to stay helpful because birthdays had once meant something in our family before the tone of our home shifted toward performance instead of affection. The guests began arriving in the late afternoon, carrying brightly wrapped gifts and greeting Evan with cheerful voices, and I kept close to the kitchen preparing snacks, hoping quietly that the day would pass without incident. But humiliation has a way of arriving when you least expect it, and I felt the tension begin when I heard Haley tell one of the mothers that I insisted on handling the food because I did not trust anyone else painting me again as controlling rather than supportive, and I forced myself to keep working because correcting her would only invite new conflict. The real turning point came when I carried a tray of cupcakes into the living room and Evan wrinkled his nose dramatically, as if a foul smell had entered the space, and he said loud enough for everyone to hear that the whole house smelled strange, because old people never know how to keep themselves clean, and laughter rippled through the room as my face flushed so deeply I felt heat crawl down my neck. I tried to steady my breath, reminding myself that this was my granddaughter's day, and not the place to argue, but then he added that living with someone so broke made everything harder for the family because I could not even contribute to simple expenses, and something inside me cracked so quietly that no one else heard it, but I felt it like a thread snapping in my chest. I set the tray down carefully, my hands trembling, and when I tried to walk past him, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path while the guests looked on in uncomfortable silence, and he leaned in close enough that I felt the heat of his breath as he said that I was useless, that the only thing I brought into the house was trouble and chores and complaints. His words splintered into me with a cruelty I had never imagined my son capable of, and I whispered through a tightening throat that I was still his mother, hoping that somewhere inside him, the child I raised still existed. But he straightened his shoulders, and with a voice sharp enough to slice through the room, he shouted not anymore. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum pulling all the air out of the room, and for a moment, I could not move, could not think, could not breathe, while the guests stood frozen in place, pretending they had not heard what they had heard, though their eyes betrayed the truth that everyone had witnessed my last shred of dignity being torn away. My knees weakened, but I refused to let myself fall, and I turned away from him, gripping the edge of the counter for balance, as the room buzzed with people whispering awkward excuses to leave early, their discomfort filling the space like smoke, while I gathered the broken pieces of myself, quietly careful not to let anyone see how deeply his words had cut. When the house finally emptied and I stepped outside for air, the cold wind whipped across my face, grounding me just enough to stay upright, and I reached instinctively for the envelope still tucked in my coat. The envelope I had been too afraid to open, the envelope that had become the single thread connecting me to something beyond the cruelty of that house. My hands shook as I slid my finger beneath the seal. Not from cold, but from fear that opening it would reveal nothing, that all the hope I had carried silently for years would collapse in one swift motion. But I opened it anyway because something in me had shifted the moment Evan denied me as his mother, something bold enough to rise through the hurt and say no more. The papers inside rustled softly in the wind, and as I read the first line, my breath caught in my throat because the document confirmed that I owned 32% of a renewable energy company my sister had invested in before she disappeared from my life, a company I had assumed was small and struggling. Yet now it held the weight of something significant, something alive, something valuable. My vision blurred as the truth settled into me slowly, like warmth spreading across frozen skin, and I realized that all this time, while Evan and Haley treated me like nothing, like someone who had no value, no purpose, no worth, I had been holding something powerful. Something neither of them knew existed, something that could change everything. I stood under the streetlight, letting the wind tangle my hair as the papers fluttered gently in my hand, and even though my heart still ached from the sting of being cast aside, I felt a new pulse beneath the pain, a pulse that whispered that this humiliation was not the end of my story, that maybe it was the turning point, the moment the world had pushed me down hard enough for me to finally stand up. I folded the papers carefully and pressed them to my chest, not as a shield against the cold, but as a promise to myself, a promise that the next words spoken in my life would not be words of surrender, but words of reclaiming everything I had lost, starting with the truth of who I was and what I carried, a truth my son had never bothered to look for, but one that was about to redefine every step I took from this moment forward. I walked slowly along the sidewalk with the envelope clutched inside my coat, feeling the papers shift against my chest as if they carried a heartbeat of their own, and even though the wind kept slicing across my face, the sting could not compare to the echo of Evan's voice still ringing inside me, that final, not anymore replaying like a bruise beneath my ribs. Yet beneath that bruise something steady had begun to take shape, a quiet awareness that the humiliation I had endured was no longer the only truth in my life, because the papers in my hands revealed a path I never knew existed. I kept moving until I reached the small bus shelter at the end of the block, and as I sat down on the cold metal bench, trying to process what I had just discovered, a black sedan pulled up to the curb so smoothly it startled me. The window lowering just enough for a man in a tailored coat to lean toward me with an expression that held no judgment, only purpose, and he asked softly if I was Marcy Lane. For a moment I felt panic wrap around my throat because strangers rarely knew my name, and certainly not men who looked like they stepped out of a boardroom rather than a neighborhood bus stop. But something in his voice felt grounded and steady, so I nodded cautiously, clutching the envelope tighter as he stepped out of the car holding a leather folder close to his chest. He introduced himself as Daniel Foster from a financial institution in Phoenix, and when he said Phoenix, my breath hitched because it was the city printed on the documents inside the envelope, the city where my sister had lived before disappearing from my life. He asked if we could speak somewhere warmer, and before I could decide whether to trust him, the bus shelter lights flickered above us, and I felt the cold tightening in my fingers. So I stood slowly and followed him to the car, sitting carefully in the passenger seat, while he opened the folder with deliberate movements that made my heart pound. He placed a set of printed documents on his lap and looked at me with a measured calm before telling me that the renewable energy company my sister had invested in had undergone major expansion in the last decade, and that my 32% stake, which I had always assumed held little value, had recently been valued at approximately $12 million due to the upcoming public offering, and the words $12 million drifted through the air so slowly I almost thought I had misheard them. My hand tightened on the envelope as he continued explaining that Lorraine had left a trust fund in my name, separate from the company shares, a trust that had matured fully and quietly over the years, accumulating and reinvesting until it reached $41 million, and when he said those words I felt my lungs seize because nothing in my life had prepared me for numbers like that. Numbers that did not belong to someone who lived in a cold basement sewing clothes for clients who sometimes forgot to pay. I stared at him, unable to speak, as he placed the official notice in front of me, the document bearing my sister's signature, and the activation date, which was today, the very day Evan called me worthless and shoved me out of his home, and the timing felt so sharp and precise that it sent a shiver through me like fate itself had chosen this moment to draw a line between the life I had endured and the life that had been waiting quietly for me. Daniel leaned back slightly as if giving me room to breathe, and he told me that he had been trying to locate me for days, but my address had been difficult to confirm, and he apologized for the abruptness of his arrival, though all I could do was stare at the papers in disbelief, while my heartbeat thudded so loudly I could hear it over the hum of the car engine. When I finally found my voice, it trembled as I asked him why my sister had left so much to me and so little explanation. And he said gently that Lorraine had written a short letter explaining that I had been the only family member who stood by her when she needed it most, that she trusted me to use the inheritance with kindness and strength, and that she believed the world would be better if I were given the means to build something meaningful. His words blurred at the edges as my eyes filled with tears, because I had spent decades believing I had been forgotten by her, yet even in her absence, she'd believed in me in a way no one else had. I took a long, unsteady breath and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand while Daniel waited silently, giving me the space to gather myself. And when he finally spoke again, his tone shifted, becoming more careful, as he said there was one more matter he needed to discuss. He told me that based on the information he had reviewed, it appeared there were multiple instances of financial exploitation against me, including unauthorized withdrawals, coerced transactions, and possible identity misuse, and he asked gently if I wanted to file formal charges, not with pressure, but with a steady clarity that made the question feel like a doorway opening. For a moment, the air grew thick around me, and I felt the weight of every insult, every theft, every humiliation settle into my bones. And though my lips parted slightly, I did not answer because I needed more than anger to guide me. Now I needed purpose. And as I stared at the folder in my hands, I realized the decision would shape not only my future, but the truth of what I had endured. I inhaled slowly, letting the cold air steady my thoughts, and even though I did not speak, Daniel seemed to understand something in my silence, something shifting beneath the surface of my grief, something sharp and steady that had begun to form in the shadows of everything I had survived. And as he closed the folder gently and told me we could discuss the next steps, whenever I was ready, I felt the faint flicker of a plan taking shape, not a loud plan, not a vengeful plan, but a deliberate and patient one, the kind that grows quietly until the moment it finally reveals its strength. I sat in Daniel's car long after he finished speaking, letting the truth of everything settle into my chest like a quiet storm. And even though my hands still trembled from the shock of learning that my life had changed in ways I never imagined, a strange calm began to form beneath the fear. A calm built not from certainty, but from the realization that I no longer had to move through the world as someone powerless. And as I stepped out of the car into the cold evening air, I felt the papers inside my coat shift like they were reminding me that this time I had something solid to stand on. I walked toward my small rented room with slow, deliberate steps, turning over the decision in my mind again and again. And by the time I reached the front steps, I knew what I needed to do first, not with anger, but with clarity. Early the next morning, I contacted a local attorney whose brochure I had picked up years ago when the library hosted a seminar on elder financial abuse, a seminar I attended out of curiosity rather than necessity, never imagining that one day I would sit in her office with a folder full of receipts and messages documenting everything my own son and his wife had taken from me. The attorney, a woman named Carla Turner with steady eyes and a voice that carried both firmness and compassion, listened without interrupting as I explained the past year in careful detail. And as she leaned forward to examine the documents I had been gathering in secret, she shook her head slowly, saying that this was not just mistreatment, but a pattern of exploitation that the law took very seriously. Hearing her say the word exploitation made my stomach twist because it forced me to confront what I had been avoiding, yet it also lit a spark of resolve inside me, a quiet promise that I would not let that pattern continue unchecked. Carla moved quickly, gathering information, drafting requests, outlining the steps we would take, and as I watched her work with practiced precision, I felt something ease inside me, a sense that for the first time in years, someone was standing beside me rather than above me. She explained that we could pursue the recovery of stolen funds, that we could request records from the bank, proving unauthorized transactions, that we could obtain digital copies of social media posts where Haley bragged about things they purchased using money that did not belong to them. And I sat there absorbing each detail, carefully feeling the weight of my past, lifting little by little as she traced a path forward that I had never known existed. When we finished the meeting, she placed a hand on mine gently and told me that I did not need to shoulder any more of the burden alone. And I nodded slowly, because even though fear still lingered, something stronger had begun to unfurl inside me. With the first steps of the legal process underway, I returned to my rented room feeling lighter than I had felt in months. And as I looked around the small space filled with bolts of fabric buttons, sorted into jars, and the old sewing kit I had saved from the basement, an idea formed in my mind, an idea that felt both familiar and new, something that belonged to me in a way nothing in Evan's house ever had. I spent the next 2 days cleaning the small room, clearing a corner for a work table, setting up the spare machine that a neighbor had given me years ago when she upgraded her own equipment, and I began organizing materials with the same care I used to reserve for clients. Then I posted a simple message on a community board offering free sewing workshops for women who wanted to learn basic mending and tailoring. And within a few hours, the replies started coming in from women who said they always wanted to learn, but never had a teacher. Women who said they admired my work. Women who said they needed a space to gather and breathe. I smiled quietly because even though I was not charging a fee, each workshop felt like rebuilding a part of myself. Brick by brick, stitch by stitch, and each time someone thanked me, I felt a warmth that reminded me I still had a place in the world, even if my own son could not see it. While I was teaching these workshops, Carla continued her work behind the scenes, sending formal requests to the bank, demanding security footage of transactions Evan made, using my card without permission, filing paperwork to freeze any ongoing withdrawals connected to my accounts, pushing for access to Haley's public social media history, which contained posts and messages showing purchases made with funds I never authorized. And each update she sent reminded me that the truth was no longer something buried in receipts and quiet suspicions, but something taking shape in documented evidence. I told no one about the workshops or the legal steps, not even the women who attended the classes, keeping everything close to my chest like the envelope from Arizona, because silence had once been a prison, but now it served as protection, allowing me to move without interference, while the foundation of my new life formed quietly beneath my feet. Evan and Haley remained unaware of everything unfolding, unaware that the mother they dismissed as weak and useless was now building something they could neither control nor erase, unaware that each stitch I taught in the workshop and each document Carla gathered brought me one step closer to reclaiming the dignity they tried so hard to take from me. And even though part of me still grieved the loss of the family, I once believed we could be another part of me, stronger and clearer than I had ever known, whispered that sometimes rebuilding does not begin with forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it begins with finally choosing to stand for yourself after years of bending. And with each passing day, I felt myself rising a little taller, anchored not by anger, but by the unmistakable knowledge that the balance of power in my life had begun to shift in a way none of us could ignore. The morning the article came out, I was sitting at my small folding table preparing fabric pieces for the afternoon workshop, letting the quiet hum of the sewing machine settle my thoughts, when my phone buzzed with 3 messages from women in the group telling me to check the local news, and as I opened the link they sent, I felt my breath catch, because staring back at me was a headline I never expected to see in my lifetime, a headline that carried my name into every living room in Omaha. Local seamstress to open women's center after sudden inheritance. The article described me as a longtime community helper who planned to use a recent financial windfall to support women facing economic hardship. And even though the reporter did not mention exact numbers, the words sudden inheritance were enough to ignite curiosity across the city. And as I read the short profile about my workshops, my past work, and my intention to build a safe space for women, a strange mixture of pride and fear washed over me, because I knew people would start asking questions that Evan and Haley were not ready to hear. I told myself to stay calm and focus on the work ahead, but within an hour, the article had been shared dozens of times, including by Haley, whose caption read, "This is hilarious. She is acting like she is some kind of hero now," and as I read her words, I felt that old familiar sting in my chest, the sting of someone who had taken so much from me, still trying to claim control. But the sting faded quickly when I clicked the comments and saw something I had never seen before. Instead of cheering her on, her friends and acquaintances responded with confusion, then criticism, then outright confrontation, asking why she mocked a woman who spent years helping her family, pointing out that everyone in the neighborhood knew I paid for daycare and groceries, questioning why Haley seemed threatened by a woman simply trying to help others, and the more people commented, the more Haley lashed out, accusing me of manipulating sympathy until someone posted a screenshot of Haley bragging months earlier about using someone else's card to pay off a vacation. I watched that thread unravel like a rope, finally snapping each comment, pulling away the layers of illusion Haley tried so hard to maintain. And for the first time, I felt no fear at the exposure, because none of it was my doing, it was simply truth, rising to the surface on its own. I was still reading when a loud knock hit the glass front door of the workshop, so sharp and forceful it made several women jump. And as I stepped forward to open it, I saw Evan standing outside with his face flushed and his jaw tight, breathing hard like he had run all the way there, and in that moment before he spoke, I understood that the article had reached him in the worst possible way. The moment I cracked open the door, he shoved it wider, stepping inside with an energy that made the room contract around him, and he began shouting without even looking at the women gathered around the tables, demanding to know why I lied to him, why I pretended to be poor, why I hid money from him, why I embarrassed him, throwing accusation after accusation so quickly that I could barely form a response, and the room fell into a stunned silence as every woman froze at her station. I tried to say his name softly, tried to calm him, but he stepped closer until he was towering over me, his voice carrying through the room with a sharpness that made several women flinch, and he shouted, "You owe me after everything I did for you, you ungrateful burden." The same words he used in the garage, but now louder, sharper, echoing against the workshop walls. What neither of us realized yet was that one of the younger women, a college student named Brianna, who always sat near the back, had automatically lifted her phone when he began yelling, recording the entire confrontation with the steadiness of someone who had seen too many moments like this in her own life. And when Evan shoved the nearest chair with enough force that it toppled and skidded across the floor, I heard women gasp as Brianna whispered quietly into her phone, "I am recording this for safety." His anger grew as he demanded money, demanded explanations, demanded apologies he had no right to ask for, until finally I said the only thing that came to mind, "I never owed you anything except love, and you threw that away." And the moment the words left my mouth, he stopped shouting only to laugh in that cold, familiar way and say, "You think anyone is going to believe your side after everything?" That sentence became the turning point because Brianna stepped forward slightly and said, "They will, Mr. Lane, because the whole city is watching." And the look on Evan's face shifted with such sudden confusion that even I felt a jolt, and he spun around to see several phones raised from different angles, women documenting what he assumed he had the right to do in private. And in that instant, something inside him cracked as he turned and stormed out of the workshop without another word. Within 30 minutes, the video hit social media because Brianna sent it to the local journalist who had written the article, explaining that this was the real reason the Women's Center was needed. And the clip spread faster than anything I had ever seen, reaching 1.8 million views before sunset. The entire city watched Evan calling his mother worthless and demanding money she did not owe him. Watched him barge into a peaceful room full of women learning to sew. Watched him expose every piece of cruelty he had hidden behind the walls of my home. And as the comments poured in, calling him entitled, unkind, manipulative, and cruel, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, because at last the truth I had carried alone had been set down in front of the world where no one could deny it. When evening fell, I sat alone in the quiet workshop, surrounded by fabric and half-finished projects, and even though my heart ached, I felt a calm strength rising in me, because the exposure was no longer mine to fear, it was his to face. And for the first time, I understood that sometimes justice begins not with revenge, but with truth finding the light on its own. The days following the viral video unfolded with a heaviness that felt almost surreal, as if I were watching Evan's life unravel from a distance, while still feeling every painful thread snapping inside my chest, because no matter what he had done, he was still my child. Yet the consequences he had earned arrived with a speed and precision that made it clear the world had finally seen him the way I had been forced to see him for years. The first blow came from the bank only 48 hours after the confrontation, when Carla called to inform me that the fraud department had officially opened an investigation into the unauthorized transactions connected to my accounts, and that due to the volume and pattern of activity, the bank had frozen Evan's debit cards and credit lines for the duration of the inquiry. And though part of me expected to feel triumphant, I instead felt an ache settle beneath my ribs, because the son who once cried when he scraped his knee was now being flagged as a financial predator. The second blow landed even harder, arriving the next morning, when Carla sent me a short message with a screenshot of an internal memo from FedEx stating that Evan had been terminated, effective immediately for aggressive behavior toward a customer behavior that had been captured on their internal cameras on the same day he stormed into my workshop. And as I read the memo slowly, I realized that his public rage had not been a single moment of loss of control, but part of a larger pattern he could no longer hide. I had barely processed that when Haley's friends began posting cryptic messages implying something had happened between her and Evan, short comments that hinted at fear and frustration. And by noon, a neighbor sent me a photo of Haley loading suitcases into her sister's car with their toddler strapped into a seat nearby, Haley's face flushed with anger and tears as she slammed the door. And even without sound, I could imagine the words she was saying, words likely similar to the ones she once threw at me without hesitation. Later that afternoon, I received a message from someone I did not recognize, a woman who said she was Haley's co-worker, and that Haley had left Evan after discovering the investigation into his financial misconduct, and that she had told people she refused to raise her child with someone who could do such a thing to his own mother. And even though I knew Haley had never been kind to me, I could not help the strange moment of sympathy that washed over me, because she, too, was now facing the wreckage of the choices she made. But the consequences did not stop with lost jobs and broken marriages, because Carla informed me that with the bank's findings and the documentation we had provided, the county prosecutor was moving forward with a case of credit fraud, since Evan had used my identity to secure several purchases without consent, and hearing the words "credit fraud" attached to my son made something inside me tremble. Not with fear, but with the heavy recognition that a wall had finally been placed between his choices and my responsibility. As days turned into a week, the ripple effect grew worse for him, and friends who once cheered for his lifestyle quietly stepped away, distancing themselves from the scandal, while neighbors who once believed his stories now avoided eye contact when he walked down the street, because the image of him screaming at his own mother in a room full of women had burned itself into their minds. Within 10 days, he had lost not only his job and access to money, but also his home, because Haley's parents refused to let him stay with them, claiming they would not expose their daughter and grandchild to the chaos he created. And Evan, who had once mocked me for sleeping on an air mattress in the basement, found himself sleeping in his truck behind a closed strip mall, cold, exhausted, and furious at a world he no longer understood. I learned this not because he told me, but because an acquaintance from the old neighborhood stopped by my workshop with a mixture of pity and unease, saying she had seen him there 3 nights in a row, eating fast food in the front seat with the engine running for heat. And for a long moment, I stood there gripping the edge of the sewing table, as the memory of my own first night homeless resurfaced with such clarity that it made my throat tighten. Even then, I could not bring myself to gloat, because the truth was that watching my child fall to the very bottom was not satisfying. It was devastating. Yet beneath that devastation was a quieter truth. one that had taken months for me to understand that sometimes the only way a person sees the damage they cause is when they finally have to sit in the emptiness they created. As the days passed, I kept teaching my workshops, kept meeting with Carla, kept rebuilding the pieces of my life one stitch at a time, and every night when I locked up the center, I found myself whispering a small prayer, not for revenge, but for clarity, for him and for me, because while I could not fix what he had broken, I could at least hope that facing the consequences would someday allow him to face himself with honesty. And yet even with that hope, I could not ignore the reality that he had reached a place I knew too well, the place where pride turns to dust and silence becomes heavier than hunger, the place where you recognize that the world will not soften for you just because you beg it to. And as I lay in bed at night, I realized he had finally entered the same darkness he once shoved me into, wandering the same cold edges of the city that had once swallowed me whole. And though it hurt to imagine my son there, it also affirmed a truth that the universe seemed determined to teach him. The truth that cruelty eventually circles back, that exploitation eventually surfaces, that the people you push down are sometimes the ones who rise with enough strength to stand without you. And as I looked toward the coming days, I understood that the next step would not be about punishing him further. It would be about standing firm in the boundaries I should have drawn years earlier. Boundaries that no amount of guilt or tears would erase again, because the fallout was no longer mine to carry. It was his, and he had finally become his own storm. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, cold Omaha day where the sky hangs low and heavy, pressing everything toward the ground, and I was sweeping the workshop floor between classes when I heard the timid scrape of shoes outside the door, a sound so soft it barely registered until it stopped directly in front of me. And when I looked up, I saw Evan standing there in a wrinkled jacket with unwashed hair, shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before his eyes. Hollow yet desperate, as if he had run out of places to hide. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I simply held the broom in my hands, feeling the weight of 1,000 memories crash into each other, because seeing your own child reduced to this does something deep inside you, something that hurts and hardens at the same time. And before I could form a single word, he stepped forward with trembling hands and blurted out that he needed help, that he had nowhere else to go, that I was the only person who could save him from hitting the kind of bottom he had once claimed belonged only to people who didn't try hard enough. He said he had been sleeping in his truck for 5 nights, that it was too cold to stay another night, that he had tried reaching out to friends, but no one wanted to be associated with him now that the video had gone everywhere. And as he spoke, the arrogance that had once been his shield collapsed under the weight of consequences he never imagined would fall on him, not because he believed he was innocent, but because he believed his actions would never matter enough to follow him into the real world. His voice cracked as he explained how Haley wouldn't let him see his son, how her family blocked his number, how his bank accounts were frozen and he couldn't buy food without borrowing a few dollars from strangers outside convenience stores. And when he finally paused to breathe, his eyes filled slowly with a wetness that made him look younger, almost like the boy I once held when he was feverish and afraid of thunder. But then he said something that pulled me from nostalgia and grounded me firmly in the present. "Please, Mom. I need money to start over. I need something to get back on my feet. You are my last chance. You are my mother." The words tumbled out in an unsteady rush, and the moment he said, "You are my mother," I felt something tighten, then loosen in my chest all at once, because coming from the same boy who had screamed, "Not anymore," in my face only weeks earlier, the plea landed like a bitter echo. I set the broom aside quietly and walked to a nearby table, placing both my hands on its edge so I could steady myself before letting any words come out, because I wanted to speak without shaking, without letting anger take over, without letting guilt soften what needed to be said. He took a step toward me, repeating please, as if the word itself might unlock the version of me he knew for years, the version who would sacrifice anything to keep him comfortable. And I finally lifted my head and let my eyes meet his, so he would understand every syllable. When I begged, you laughed. I said it softly, but firmly, and the moment the sentence left my mouth, something in him flinched so visibly it was like watching a structure lose its final support beam. Because he remembered that day in the garage. He remembered the smirk he wore. He remembered the words he threw at me like stones. And for the first time, I saw him realize that the past did not evaporate just because he wished it would. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words formed, only a shaky breath. So I continued speaking slowly and evenly, telling him that I had spent years believing his needs mattered more than my survival, that I had justified every cruelty as stress or youth or misunderstanding, that I had allowed myself to shrink so he could expand. But those days were gone now, not because I stopped loving him, but because I finally started loving myself enough to draw a line he could not erase. He stared at me with confusion and fear swirling in his eyes, as if he could not reconcile the woman before him with the mother he once controlled. And as the silence stretched, he whispered that he thought I didn't have anything, that I was too weak and too stuck in my small life to ever rise without him. And there was something so painfully honest in his admission that it made the next moment even heavier. It was then, for the first time, that I let the truth show its face. I own 32% of Warren Tech Energy. I just didn't need to tell you. I spoke the words calmly, not as a weapon, but as a boundary, and I watched the realization expand across his expression in slow motion, confusion first, then disbelief, then a dawning horror as he connected the dots. He had never bothered to look for the old envelope in my sewing kit, the sudden appearance of the banker, the inheritance article, the confidence he now saw in my posture and voice. His mouth parted slightly, as if he were trying to breathe in a room where the air had changed, and for the first time in his life, he saw me not as a fragile mother, but as a woman with resources, power, and agency far beyond what he had ever imagined. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and I held it intentionally because the truth needed space to settle, because he needed to feel the full weight of what he had dismissed for so long. After several seconds, he sank slowly into a chair, his head dropping into his hands, as if he could hide from the reality reshaping itself around him. And when he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed red, not from anger, but from the dawning recognition that the world was not going to bend for him the way he believed it always would. "I am your only son," he said again, softer this time, nearly a whisper, as if the title alone should grant him access to the life he once took from me. And I held his gaze with a calm that came from months of learning how to protect my spirit. "Being my son never gave you permission to break me," I replied quietly, and the moment the sentence landed, I felt something powerful settle inside me. Not victory, not vengeance, but freedom. A freedom built from choosing myself without apology. I stood there in the quiet of the workshop, the fabric rolls stacked neatly behind me, the faint hum of the heater filling the space with a steadiness I desperately needed. And for a long moment, Evan and I simply breathed in the same room without speaking. Suspended between everything we used to be and everything we could no longer return to, and I knew that whatever came next had to come from a place of clarity rather than anger, because anger was what had shaped him, not what would free either of us. I walked to the small filing cabinet in the corner, the one I kept locked not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the difficult truths stored inside it. And as I opened the drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, I felt the entire atmosphere shift, as if the weight of the past had been lifted from its hiding place and placed gently between us. When I turned back to him, he looked up with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope, something caught in the fragile space between desperation and realization. and I set the envelope on the table in front of him, sliding it across the wood until it rested near his shaking hands. He stared at it for a long moment before finally asking what it was, his voice rough and small, and I answered with the same calm I had been building for months. It is a copy of the charges I could file against you: elder financial exploitation, credit fraud, identity, misuse documentation of unauthorized transactions. It is everything the law says I am allowed to pursue. He inhaled sharply as if the air had suddenly thickened, and he looked at the envelope the way someone looks at an edge they never meant to reach. But before he could speak, I continued, making sure every word carried both truth and compassion. I am not giving this to you to threaten you, Evan. I am giving it to you so you understand the line. You cross the line, I will not let you cross again. I will not destroy you, but I will not save you. Saying it out loud felt like freeing something inside me that had been trapped for years, something that had been crushed under the weight of excuses and guilt and love, twisted into obligation. And Evan looked at me with a confusion that slowly shifted into something closer to recognition, as if he finally saw the woman who stood before him, rather than the version of me he had convinced himself he could control. He asked what he was supposed to do now, how he was supposed to survive without my help, what step he should take when every door was closed to him. And as I listened, I realized that for the first time, he was not demanding answers from me. He was asking from a place of vulnerability he had spent years burying. I told him that accountability was the first step, honesty the second, and effort the third. And as I glanced toward the sewing tables lined with projects the women had left behind, an idea formed with a simplicity that felt almost poetic. I asked him whether he was willing to work not for money, not for sympathy, but for the sake of rebuilding himself piece by piece, and he nodded automatically because he thought I meant a job, any job, something to get him back on his feet. But instead, I gestured to the workshop around us, the community board on the wall, the piles of donated fabric waiting to be sorted, the boxes of clothing waiting to be repaired for women who had walked through the same storms I once walked, and I said he could begin here. His face twisted with confusion, then disbelief, then a flicker of resistance, but I continued speaking, laying the terms out, with the same clarity that had guided me from the day he pushed me out of his home. You will work here under supervision, doing whatever needs to be done, organizing materials, repairing tables, cleaning floors, helping the people who walk through this door without expecting anything in return. This is part of learning what you refused to learn when you had every advantage. It is part of becoming someone different than the man you have been. He protested at first, saying that helping in a sewing center made no sense, that it was beneath him that people would laugh, and his words carried the same arrogance he once used to diminish me. But then he saw the look in my eyes, and his voice quieted, because he realized this was not humiliation. It was restoration. The same kind I had to claw my way through when I had nothing left. I told him he would not be paid, that this was not employment, but rehabilitation, something Carla and I had discussed quietly in the past few days, because she believed, and I agreed, that sometimes justice did not require punishment, but transformation. And Evan swallowed hard as he absorbed the truth that the only path forward was one he had to walk with humility rather than entitlement. To my surprise, he accepted, not loudly or proudly, but with a small nod that carried a weight. I recognized the weight of someone who had finally run out of ways to avoid the truth. The next morning he arrived early, still wearing the same worn jacket, still carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been stripped down to the bone, and I watched from across the room as he swept the floor carefully, then organized fabrics by color, then repaired a broken chair leg with quiet concentration, and the women who arrived later did not stare or whisper. They simply watched him with the same cautious hope they once offered me, because they too knew what it meant to rebuild from nothing. Over the next days, he returned again and again, working silently, head down, shoulders slowly relaxing, as the rhythm of honest effort began stitching something back together inside him, and I realized that this was the justice I had wanted all along. Not destruction, not revenge, but a kind of full-circle accountability that allowed dignity to grow where cruelty once lived. And every evening when the workshop emptied and the sun dipped behind the Omaha rooftops, I cleaned the tables and turned off the lights, feeling something I had not felt in years. Something soft but solid, a blend of strength and peace, because justice had been served without violence, without shouting, without bitterness. And even though Evan had a long road left to walk, he was walking it on ground he could no longer pretend was beneath him. In the weeks that followed the quiet transformation inside the workshop, I found myself moving through each day with a steadiness I had never known, before a sense of grounding that grew with every woman who walked through our doors, and every moment I reminded myself that survival was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. And when the news finally came about Warrantech going public, it arrived in the form of a simple email from Daniel, written without fanfare, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime. And I remember sitting at my small desk, with the light spilling across the grain of the wood as I read the numbers twice, and then a third time until their meaning settled gently into my chest. The value of my shares had nearly doubled overnight, and I let out a breath I had been holding for years, not because of the money itself, but because the world had finally shifted into a place where I could build without fear that someone would take everything from me again. I used that momentum to secure leases for 3 new locations, spaced throughout Omaha, so women in different corners of the city could find a place to stand back up, and each center blended sewing training with financial counseling and emotional support, because I knew intimately how easily a life could unravel when money and dignity were stripped away, and I wanted no woman to feel as alone as I once did on that freezing driveway, with nothing but a broken frame in my hands. The local paper visited one afternoon asking about the expansion, and I spoke with a calm clarity that surprised even me as I explained the mission, the purpose, the community we were building, and within days, donations arrived at our doorstep along with letters from women thanking me for making space for lives like theirs, and slowly people began referring to me as a leader, a founder, a figure of strength. Words I never imagined would be attached to my name, yet hearing them did not make me proud in the way I expected. Instead, they filled me with a quiet warmth, because I realized I had become the version of myself I used to dream about when the world felt unbearably small. Meanwhile, Evan continued working day after day in silent, sweeping floors, organizing thread spools, repairing chairs, running errands for staff. And although I kept a respectful distance, I watched him in the edges of my vision as he arrived earlier than required and left later than expected. His shoulders no longer hunched in anger, but lowered in humility. And the women who once looked at him with open distrust slowly began greeting him with cautious nods that eventually softened into small conversations, and he listened, truly listened to their stories, as if absorbing the truth that harm did not begin with grand acts, but with tiny cruelties repeated over time. One evening after the last volunteer left, he approached me while I was closing the cash box, and he thanked me without excuses or embellishments, his voice steady but humbled, saying he finally understood the cost of what he had done and the weight I had carried alone for years, and although I did not reach for him, I acknowledged his words with a gentle nod, because forgiveness was not a door I could open all at once. It was a series of small steps, and allowing him to stand in that moment without shame was one of them. Weeks passed. The centers thrived, and the community grew around the mission like a quilt stitched by many hands. And as I stood at the opening ceremony of the 3rd location, with women cheering and lights twinkling against the glass windows, I felt a swell of gratitude that nearly brought me to my knees, because I understood then, with absolute certainty, that healing was not simply recovering from what had been taken, It was choosing to live in a way that honored the strength it took to survive. And when a young reporter asked me to sum up my journey in one sentence, I paused, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and warm fabric, and I spoke the truth that had grown inside me since the day Evan pushed me out of his house and unknowingly pushed me back into myself. I did not rise because I got $41 million. I rose because I finally chose myself. The room grew still for a moment, as if everyone collectively absorbed the truth behind those words. Then applause rose like a wave, filling the space with a resonance I felt in my bones. And as I looked across the crowd, I saw Evan in the back, watching quietly, not with guilt anymore, but with the awareness of someone finally learning how to stand. So if Marcy's journey reminded you that boundaries are a form of love, share this story with someone who needs courage today.